I appreciate Drew teaching our class last week. He always does an excellent job. Hear good things about the work he does, and so we appreciate his work. Today we're going to look at chapter 29. I told you the last time I was with you, we're because of our cancellation of our meeting, or our moving our meeting to August, we're a week off on our schedule. And I told you we would cover 29 and 30 today, and 31 next week, and then we're going to go back and look at some miscellaneous Proverbs. Well, I changed my mind. We're going to look at 29 today, 30 next week. That's why you have the same questions for next week, and then 31 the final week. And so that's our plan. That's our change of schedule. So hold on to those questions. If you didn't have, there's some extra up here if you're missing that, and that'll be for next week, Proverbs 30. Proverbs 1 to 9 will not take the time, as we have not been doing for our last several weeks, reviewing the 9 chapters, because from chapter 10 on, we don't really review much because they're just miscellaneous Proverbs. So you have miscellaneous Proverbs in this chapter and miscellaneous Proverbs in this chapter and various Proverbs in the next. But in chapters 1 to 9, the major point is summarized in chapter 9. You have wisdom personified as a woman inviting you to her feast, and you have folly personified as a woman inviting you to her feast. Which feast will you partake of? And that's the summary of chapters 1 to 9. So chapters 10 to 31 is the wisdom that is offered. Are you going to listen to this wisdom, or are you not going to listen to this wisdom? So let's go to chapter 29 now. And in chapter 29, here are general proverbs and miscellaneous thoughts. Some new thoughts here, as we often have, and then there's some repetition from other sections of Proverbs. For example, you'll notice number 4 is the tongue. Well, that's not surprising. We've had a number of things on the tongue. We have concerning righteousness and sin, number 5. Contrasting of the views of the righteous man, or pride versus humility, number 13. We have a lot of repeating and reoccurring themes, and if God repeated it 50 times, then he must have thought I needed to say it 50 times. So we're going to look at it for the 50th time, if that's the case that we're doing. Some new thoughts here that we're going to see that we haven't seen a lot of. For example, number 11, pampering and spoiling. We haven't seen a great deal about the equality of the rich and poor. We've seen some of that, but not a great deal about that. So some new themes taking and occurring here. So let's go to our questions. Number 1, let's start with the rebellion, the first subject, first grouping of thoughts. And if you're visiting, what we've been doing in Proverbs is, rather than taking these verse by verse, we cover every verse, but we're grouping them by subject matter. So the first thought here is rebellion in verse 1. We scan and see if there's more on rebellion. Well, verse 9, verse 19 fit into that category. Same thing with all the others. So let's go to question number 1. What do you learn about rebellion from verse 1, verse 9, verse 19? All right, that's good. What else? All right, that's good. Okay, that's good. That's good. And shouldn't at times. Say again? Yeah, one who's stubborn won't listen. That's good. All right, let's look at these 3 verses and see what we learn, and you can add more to that as we go along. Let's start with verse 1. He who is often reproved and hardens his neck will suddenly be destroyed, and that without remedy. I'm learning from that. I've listed here some things we learned, that there is rebellion in spite of reproof. You can you give reproof or rebuke a fool, or rebellious person, that is a fool, and they're still going to rebel, and they're going to fail, they're going to fall. There is no success in that rebellion. All right, verse 9. Anything else on verse 1 that you learn? Yeah, no, it's not a good outcome. I'm interested in the fact that verse 1 talks about that you may often reprove him, and then he hardens his neck. Do you suppose, in light of like Psalm 95 in Hebrews 3, Hebrews 4, that the more they rebel, that's actually saying the heart becomes harder? I think that's what Psalm 95 is saying. I think that's what Hebrews 3 is saying. That's what Hebrews 4 is saying. The more you rebel once, your heart's hardened a little bit. But you rebel again, it's hardened even more. You rebel again, and it's hardened even more. And the more you rebel, you're becoming more hardened in your position, more hardened in your rebellion. I learned that from this context. Let's go to verse 9. What do you learn from verse 9? The wise man contends with the foolish man. Whether the fool rages or laughs, there is no peace. What's it saying? Yeah, you don't get anywhere with the fool. If they're not willing to listen to some wisdom, we're not going to get anywhere with that. And so the proverb is saying that if you contend with him, it doesn't matter whether he rages or he laughs. What does that mean? Either way, good point. Yeah, you contend with a fool, you may make him angry, and he rages, he's mad, he's angry. Well, you're not going to get anywhere with that. But then he may treat it and laugh at it. Just it's trivial, it doesn't matter, and he ridicules you. Either way, you didn't get anywhere with the fool. You end up not accomplishing any peace. You didn't work it out. And so here again is that rebellious spirit. Verse 19. Verse 19 says, a servant will not be corrected by mere words, for though he understands, he will not respond. What do you learn from that? All right? If there are no consequences, words are ineffective. Good point. Anything else? Anything else you learned from verse 19? One of the things I learned from verse 19 is that our words have to be enforced. Now, I think he's talking about dealing with a fool here, not necessarily your children, not necessarily perhaps the government, but here's a general principle, that if there's not some teeth put into the law or teeth put into the rule or to the rebuke, it is ineffective. Does that make sense? You tell your child no, and the child realizes, you know what, the mom and dad's saying no, but there's not any consequence. I'm not going to get a spanking. I'm not going to be punished. I'm not going to be grounded. I'm just going to be told no, and I'm going to be told no again, and no again, and no again. What's going to happen? You're going to keep on. Keep on. Same thing, you arrest somebody and tell them they shouldn't have done that, and then you turn them loose, and then you arrest them again, and you turn them loose. Guess what's going to happen? They're going to continue on. That's the principle of verse 19, I think. A servant is corrected by mere words. Though he understands, he will not respond. So he knows what you're talking about. He knows what you want. Anything else on rebellion? Verse 1, 9, and 19. Maybe you saw another verse that deals with rebellion. All right, there are other verses that could relate to that, but let's move on. The next category is righteous versus wicked rulers. There's a general principle of righteousness versus wickedness here, but he's focusing seemingly in all of these verses on leaders or rulers and the difference in them. So let's see what we've got here. Verse 2. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice, but when a wicked man rules, the people groan. Let's all groan. Means we have wicked rulers is what my point was. What do you learn from verse 2?
Righteous people rule, but people are glad.
Yeah. The verse may be implying that the person who's ruling is a righteous person in the sense that he is right with God, he's living right with God, he's a child of God, he's in a covenant relationship. I'm taking it perhaps more in the sense he rules with principles of righteousness and justice, more than he's a Christian. Let's take in our own country. We've only had one man in the Oval Office that was supposed to be a New Testament Christian. But other than that, there hasn't been anyone in leadership that is a New Testament Christian that we would label as a righteous man. But there are people who rule that have principles of justice and righteousness and fairness, principles of law. I take that's what this verse is talking about. That when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. Why would they rejoice? There's accountability. That if they're ruling with justice and fairness, I'm going to be treated just and fair, as well as the person who's living wicked is going to be treated just and fair. There is principles of justice. The counterpart of that, verse 2, when a wicked man rules, the people groan. Why do they groan when a wicked man rules? I take it he's not righteous, he's not just, he's not fair, he's not honorable, he's not honest. Why do they groan? They're going to make laws they don't agree with?
It's just like, there's justice with the righteous leader, but there won't be justice with
Yeah, there's not going to be justice. There's not going to be fairness. There's going to be things that are tolerated that shouldn't be tolerated, and therefore the people mourn and the people groan. Let's go to verse 4. Verse 4 talks about the king establishes his land by justice, but he who receives bribes overthrows it. 2 points we learn from verse 4. What are you learning? A good leader, righteous ruler, will establish fair and impartial justice. Do you learn that from verse 4? Yeah, honesty, yeah. That he's going to be fair and impartial. That alludes to the principle found back in verse 2. Verse 4 also talks about dishonesty overthrows a nation. We saw that in chapter 14, verse 34. A sin is a reproach to any people. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. So a king that establishes land by justice is, but the one that receives bribes and is dishonest, he overthrows the nation. It's part of the upheaval of a nation is the dishonesty. More about that in a moment. Verse 12. Now, verse 12 is quite interesting to me. So let's talk about verse 12. Verse 12 says, if a ruler pays attention to lies, his servants become wicked. What do you learn from that?
People will follow their leader no matter what kind of leader they are.
All right. People follow their leader no matter how. If he's wicked, then people are going to follow that direction. They're going to become wicked too. What else do you learn from verse 12? All right. Sometimes he's gullible. Good point. And he swallows things he shouldn't swallow. He buys into things he shouldn't buy into. We'll come back to that principle here in a second. I'm not fishing for any particular thing. I'm interested in what you think the text may be saying. All right. That's true. Yes, sir. Jody? Okay, that's true. Quite often wicked men surround themselves by wicked men, and they're yes men. I take it this verse is in that the wicked encourage wrong. How so? Well, let's go back to verse 12. That if a ruler pays attention to lies, suppose you're working for a leader, you're on his staff, you're in his cabinet, and you know he's listening to fabricated information and followed that, what that gives you the temptation to do, particularly if you're not going to be totally honest? Fabricate information. Would that not be the case? You see, my boss listened to lies. He bought into this sales pitch that he was given. I saw that happen, so consequently, I'm going to package up some lies and see if I can sell him on that to get what I want. And so wickedness encourages wickedness. So when the leader is one who pays attention to lies, he listens to lies, all of his servants become wicked. They all become liars because they want to be listened to. He'll listen to me too. And I'm going to fabricate whatever I have to fabricate. Verse 18, talking about wicked and righteous leaders. Where there is no revelation, the people cast off restraint, but happy is he who keeps the law. What's that talking about? Good point. Yeah, anarchy reigning because they're rejecting God. Good point. If you have the English Standard Version, your footnote in the New King James will say the same thing. Where there is no prophetic vision, the people cast off restraint. Has to do with listening to the revelation of God. When you cast off the revelation of God, the New King James calls it the revelation. The New Century said where there is no word from God, the people are uncontrolled. So in other words, if you don't obey God's law, I put here to simply perish, but it says even more than that. It's the idea that with the rejection of God's law, the people are out of control. That's happening in our own nation. We've pushed God out of the schools. We've pushed God, the mentioning of God in our society. You're not supposed to be mentioning Christianity and God, and you push all of that out of your society. The people are uncontrolled. No wonder we have the chaos in our society. And consequently, verse 18 says, but happy is those who keep the law. It's a greater nation, a greater administration when we turn to God's law. Any questions or comments you want to add to this wicked versus righteous leaders?
Donnie, I think it shows that righteous principles are original to God.
Say again.
I think it shows that righteous principles are original to God.
Yes, good point. That is a good point. They were not devised by men, but they are original with God. So if it is a righteous principle, it came from God. And so it goes back to the revelation and the prophetic vision. All right. Let's talk about verse 3. We're ready for point 3 in this 15 points. The effect of children on parents. Quite often we've seen Proverbs about the effect of parents on children. This is coming in the reverse. So let's go to verse 3. Whoever loves wisdom makes his father rejoice, but a companion of harlot wastes his wealth. What's that saying?
If you love your wisdom, then it'll make your parents glad. Companion of prostitutes, you destroy your parents.
All right. Yeah, it's not only wasting wealth, you're wasting your life, you're wasting your opportunities, destroying your influence. I think the general principle of the proverb is if you listen to wisdom, you bring joy to your parents. If you're foolish, no matter what behavior is that you're doing that's foolish, you're wasting your life, you're wasting your time, etc. Your parents view it as just a waste. Questions or comments on the effect of parents on children? Or children on parents, rather. All right, let's go to number 4. Let's talk about the tongue. Let's go to question 2. What do you learn about the tongue from verse 5, verse 11, verse 20? What'd you learn? What else?
Well, verse 4 is what? If somebody's flattering you with their tongue, they're just trying to get something from you.
All right. They're flattering you with their tongue. They're after something. They're building up praise. More about that in a second. What else do you learn about the tongue? Okay. Good point. Good point. What else you learn about the tongue? Absolutely. Absolutely. Here are 3 things I've listed from these verses. Perhaps you have more. The one who would flatter is spreading a net. Let's look at verse 5. A man who flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. The New Century calls flatter false praise. I like that. One who is giving false praise, you usually can tell if someone is just commending you and making a kind comment, or are they overdoing it with praising you and lifting you up, making you feel good? They're building you up, and you better be careful about that because they're probably spreading a net. They're wanting something from you. Have you ever had that to happen? I've had that to happen multiple times. Someone just prays and prays and prays, and you think, okay, you're overdoing it. You're wanting something And usually you'll find out in time, they're wanting something. They're going to pull that back, and they think they've got a hook, and now they're wanting something from you. They're spreading their net. Be wary of that. Be wary of the one who constantly is flattering and praising. Verse 11, I'm learning that it must be controlled under anger. A fool vents all his feelings, but a wise man holds them back. The American Standard says, a fool uttereth all his anger. The New Century talks about he loses his temper. And so that's the idea of venting all of his feelings. He bursts forth in anger. The fool does that. So you show me someone who, in a moment of anger, they just burst forth. And they vent all their feelings. And they burst forth in their anger. They're uncontrolled. That person is indeed a foolish person. But the wise man holds them back. You want to show some wisdom and some leadership, then restrain that temper in just a little bit. You may be angry, but you don't have to burst forth. Make sense? All right, let's go to verse 20. The one who is quick to talk is indeed dangerous. The American Standard uses the word hasty. The New King James uses the word hasty. Do you see a man hasty in his words? There's more hope for a fool than for him. How would you define hasty in his words? Talk before they think. That's good. What'd you say? Quick to speak. Jared made a point earlier in the class. You don't always have to respond. The one who's always quick to come back with a response when there's not always a response required. The one who's always quick to say something, who's always, I've got to say something, I've got to say it quick, I've got to respond, perhaps more thinking, speaking without thinking. That person, there is more hope for a fool than for him. So quick to talk indeed is dangerous. Just because I'm quick with the mind and I can say something, that could be dangerous. Could be dangerous. Anything else on the tongue? Verse 5, verse 11, verse 20, or you may have another verse you want to add to that. That's right. Slow to speak, not quick. I might think before. Quite often, do we more often, if we held our tongue, do we regret we didn't say anything, or do we more often speak and then regret we said something? And the latter more often is the case. And so the warning of the Proverbs is there. All right, anything else on the tongue? Yeah, I've got to say one more thing. I've got to, you're not going to get away without. All right, let's talk about sin versus righteousness. Not uncommon in the book of Proverbs. We see this nearly every section of Proverbs has this contrast. But here we have the one who sins and the righteous person in contrast in these verses. So let's take verse 6 and then we'll go to verse 18 and then we'll come back to 8 and 16 and then 27. So let's look at verse 6 first of all, and we're looking at contrast. The Proverbs does this quite often. By transgression an evil man is snared, but the righteous sings and rejoices. What's that saying? Yeah. Far happier and far better to be righteous than to be wicked, because the one who sins, as you said, is trapped in his sin. He's ensnared by his sin. But the righteous have every reason to rejoice. So there's sorrow on the one side, there's happiness on the other. Get verse 18 with that, where there is no revelation. Now, as we've mentioned, and for those who are visiting, we sometimes take a proverb and it fits into more than one category. Verse 18 certainly does that. For where there's no revelation, the restraint is cast off, and happy is he who keeps the law. Happiness comes with the righteousness, but sorrow and ruin comes with those who sin. Let's go back to verse 8 now. Verse 8 with that, scoffers ensnare a city, but a wise man turns away wrath. What's that saying?
The wicked can cause upset the whole city, but the wise can calm it down.
Absolutely, absolutely. Is it saying the same thing, Proverbs 14:34, righteousness exalts a nation, sin is a reproach to any people? I think so. Seems to be that that the one who sins brings God's wrath upon themselves, maybe upon the nation, upon the city, and the righteous is one who helps to contribute to turning away the wrath of God. So am I turning away the wrath or am I bringing the wrath? Let's go at verse 16. When the wicked are multiplied, transgression increases, but the righteous will see their fall. What's it saying? The fool who continues to practice sin doesn't see any real danger, so not only does he commit sin, that often leads to committing even more sin and then more sin. So he multiplies his sin, wherein the righteous, I take the phrase that he sees their fall, the righteous sees danger. That could lead to this and that could lead to that. I'm going to avoid that pitfall. I'm not going there. And so the righteous sees the danger, the wicked see no danger at all. And they can continue on plowing into their sin. We've already looked at verse 18. There's no vision. That is, they pay no attention to the revelation. The righteous follow the law. Let's go to verse 27. The last verse. The unjust man is an abomination to the righteous, but the upright is in the way is an abomination to the wicked. One translation uses the word detest. What do you see in that? All right. Absolutely. Okay. That is true. You point out someone's wrongdoing and now you are hated by them. You may be. Very well.
Play off that a little bit. Living one way or the other is almost like condemnation of the other way of living.
It is. It absolutely is. And so you're going to be detested by someone. If you're committing sin, the righteous are going to detest the way you live, despise that. If you're living righteous, the wicked are going to detest that. So I don't want to be hated, but you're going to be. You're going to be despised by someone. Your way of life is going to be despised. So it's just showing a contrast. Those who sin are an abomination to the just. Those who are righteous are an abomination to the unjust. This leads to ruin. This leads to happiness. Just a contrasting view of the ways of life. Anything else on that? All right, let's talk about number 6, caring for the poor, verse 7. The righteous considers the cause of the poor, but the wicked does not understand such knowledge. What's that saying? All right, doesn't care.
I think with the wicked, it's all about me, not about anybody else.
All right. Yes, yeah, that's what I'm fishing for right there. Yeah, they do, absolutely. The English Standard says on this verse, we're at verse 7 now, point number 6 on the screen. Number 7, the English Standard says, and many of you have that, a righteous man knows the rights of the poor, a wicked man does not understand such knowledge. I think it has to do not only with showing that I'm going to care for the poor, I'm going to give to the poor. He understands their rights. The poor generally would be those whose rights are trampled. The man who has wealth has got the power to see his rights aren't trampled, generally. The poor man can't do that. And so he recognizes the rights. He is a defender of those who are less fortunate. Does that make sense? And so he cares for the poor in the sense he recognizes their rights. The New American Standard 95 says, the righteous is concerned for the rights of the poor. The wicked does not understand such concern. They don't have concern for the poor. Their rights are trampled. They are run over, basically, by society. They don't care. So there's the contrast. Make sense? All right, let's go to the next category, which is the contrasting views of a righteous man. Now, this is quite interesting to me. So let's go to verse 10. Verse 10 says, the bloodthirsty hate the blameless, but the just seeks his well-being. What's that saying?
Sounds like the motto of the Christian.
It does. It does. Good point. Good point. The difficulty with this verse, if you're listening to the reading of this for example, I'm start with the New King James. The bloodthirsty hates the blameless, but the upright seek his well-being. There's a difficulty in translating this verse. And so one translation will say, like the New King James, that the bloodthirsty hate the blameless, but the upright seek the well-being of the blameless. And that may be what it's saying. That the blameless man, the righteous man, some people hate him, but other people seek his well-being. But the New Century, for example, said murderers hate the honest person and try to kill those who do right. As if the hatred is all through the context of that verse. And it's a difficulty in translating the verse and perhaps the original text in that. The New International said the bloodthirsty hate a person of integrity and seek to kill the upright. There's nothing in the verse, according to some translations, about defending the righteous person. It's just the hatred. I'll leave that to you to decide. Now, I want to go to verse 27, and again we see this contrasting view of a righteous person, and that is that the unjust man has an abomination for the righteous. Don't be surprised if you're hated if you're a righteous person. If you do right and you live right, don't be surprised when somebody just despises you for that. Even someone that you thought loved you and cared for you, they come to despise you. That's probably going to happen at some point in your life. All right, let's move on and talk about the equality of the rich and the poor. Verse 13, what do you learn? The poor man and the oppressor. I take that the poor man is the oppressed. The oppressor is not poor, but he oppresses the poor man. So they're not on equal terms, except for the fact, God made them both. They have this in common. Verse 13 says that God gives light to the eyes of them both. God gave life and light to them, and so there is that equality. All right, let's move on to child discipline, verses 15 and 17, and let's see what we learn about child discipline. We have 2 verses, but we have several things that we learn. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings his mother to shame. Let's go ahead and get verse 17, then we'll start listing what we learn on the screen. Correct your son, and he will give you rest, and yes, he will give delight to your soul. So let's go to our questions. Perhaps you have something that I don't have on the screen. Question number 3, what do you learn about child discipline from 15 and 17? All right. It does make your life easier and the child's life easier. What else? You will be and the child will be. Anything else?
Using a rod and reproof is hard to do. It's very hurtful to the parent doing that, but it must be done because good will come out in the end.
Good point. Good point.
Donnie, I think the one point is that it will work too. It says the rod will give wisdom. It doesn't say that they may give wisdom. It says that they give wisdom.
Good point. Good point. We saw earlier in chapter 22, verse 15, the rod will drive it far from him, the misbehavior. Again, not maybe it will if done properly.
Go along with that, if you want the child to be wise, then this is what you've got to do for him to be wise.
Good point. Good point. Yes. Yeah, we want our children to be well educated, so we want to make sure they go off to school and get their school work done, and et cetera, et cetera. Rod and reproof will give wisdom to your child, whether they go to school or not. They're going to be wise. So here's some things we learned. Number 1, use the rod. The rod is a stick or a branch. Check Vines, check Brown, Driver, and Briggs, etc. In other words, it's that same word is used with reference to dividing tribes. It's used with reference to a staff. It's used with reference to a discipline rod. And It's basically the idea of a spanking, what we think of as spanking a child. Not popular in our day, but the text says use a rod. But it says also use reproof. Sometimes we use reproof without a rod. Sometimes people want to use a rod without reproof. They don't want to give instruction. They don't want to give direction. They just want to discipline firmly with a firm hand. Rod and reproof produces wisdom. If you want your child to be wise, this is what needs to be done. What does it mean to leave a child to themselves? Say again. Yeah, let them figure it out for themselves. I'm not going to correct. I'm not going to give them a lot of guidance. I'm going to let them figure this out for themselves. A child left himself brings his mother to shame. Verse 15 and 17 both says it reflects upon the parents when the child doesn't turn out. And then verse 17 finally makes the point that it produces rest and delight. So in your old age, do you want to be have rest and rejoice in your family? Spend time in your youth raising your children properly. Make sense? All right. Let's go on. Let's talk about being hasty, verse 20. We've talked about it briefly, but let's quickly talk about hasty. What do you learn in verse 20? Don't be hasty in your words. We ought not be hasty in other areas, but especially in our words. Let's go to verse 21, pampering and spoiling. Now, this is an interesting verse because the one who pampers a servant from childhood will have him as a son in the end. Some take the verse to be a positive thing, that if you'll take a servant, a slave, and pamper him like a child, then you're basically going to have a son in the end, and it's commendable to do that. Others take it, and I take the case to be the latter, that it's not saying that slavery is right, but it's saying you have a slave or you have a servant with that principle in mind, that if you have a servant that's supposed to be in the role of a servant, not a child, and you pamper them like a child, that in the end, don't be surprised when they don't act like a servant, they act like your child. Make sense? And so the warning, I think, is be careful of spoiling and pampering one that ought not to be pampered and spoiled. So if you want the one to be treated like a child, then treat them like a child. That is your own. If you want them to be in a different role, then treat them like they're in a different role. And so they become unmanageable. The Vulgate translation would translate verse 21. Let's get number 12 and then number 14, and then we'll probably be done. Number 12, controlling our spirit. So what do we learn about controlling our spirit? Verse 11. Yeah, the man who vents all of his feelings, in other words, his anger, but a wise man holds him back. Verse 20, I lost my place. Verse 22 is where I want to go. What do you learn from verse 22? A person who bursts forth in anger is just going to stir up more strife and consequently create more transgression and sin. Yes. All right, I want to get to verse 24. Our time is about gone, so let's go to number 14, partaking in sin. Whoever is partaker with a thief hates his own soul. He swears to tell the truth, but does not. But he reveals nothing. What's that verse saying? Yeah, it brings destruction. It warns about being a partaker in someone else's sin, but there's something else that's added here to verse 24. If you're a partaker with a thief, you hate your own life. In other words, you're not very wise if you partake in another person's sin. It's very foolish to be what's the word I'm looking for when someone is Jared, when you accomplice, that's what I'm looking for. When you're accomplished to a crime or to a sin. But what's interesting is he swears to tell the truth but reveals nothing. In other words, he misleads by silence or he misleads by omission. He swears, I'll tell the truth. Yeah, I was involved, and I'm going to tell exactly what we did and who was involved, but he doesn't. And so he, by silence or by omission, he covers for other people. So you can partake in other person's sin not only by participating, but by condoning or by being silent about that. And that's the thing I learned from verse 24. Our time is gone. Proverbs 30, next time.